Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy. Now, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine started, Russia has severely limited the amount of data that it's now releasing to the West because it says that it's a security risk. So we only get a very small amount of detailed information. But every month, the Ministry of Finance publishes its official figures onto its website. And in this video, we're going to go through the figures that have been posted for October 2023. And what those figures show is that oil and gas revenue for Russia is seriously down against where it was in 2021, which was the last full year that was completely unaffected by Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. Oil and gas revenues are down around 65%. And at the same time as Russia has seen a huge fall in its income, it's also got a massive increase in expenditure because of its investment in the war in Ukraine. Expenditure is up around 34% compared to where it was in 2021. So in today's video, I'll have a detailed look at what's going on with oil and gas revenue. We'll talk about non-oil and gas revenue, which I think is a really interesting part of the P&L because we've seen a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue, and it's quite difficult to explain, but we'll go through some of that detail a bit later. We'll then have a look at what's happening with the total revenue, expenditure, and what the bottom line is for Russia, whether they're making a net deficit or a net profit. And one of the other things that we'll go through today is where I'm actually sourcing this data from, because as I mentioned, these are the official figures being published by Russia. I'm not making them up, so don't waste your time posting comments saying you don't know what you're talking about, you're fabricating all of the figures. These are the official figures that have been published by Russia. Now, before we get into all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everybody that's bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks. I genuinely appreciate it, really do value your support, so thank you so much for that. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to my Patreon channel, as well as Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube super thanks, and YouTube's membership scheme. Okay, if you're interested in checking out this data for yourself, you need to go to minfin.gov.ru/EN, if you want to read it in English, /document. And it takes you to this page, which is basically all of the public documents that the Ministry of Finance are publishing online. And if you scroll down, you need to click on the View More section. And if you select this document, which was posted on the 9th of November and is entitled Brief Monthly Information on Federal Budget Execution, Cumulative from the Beginning of the Year in Billions of Rubles. And as you can see, we've got information dating back to January 2011, so quite comprehensive. And we've got lots of different categories here. But unfortunately, not all of this information is now provided. If we scroll over to the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that we've still got all the information at the top for 2023. However, the rest of this document is very patchy in terms of the level of information that we're now being provided with. But in terms of the details of what we're actually after, we're looking for the oil and gas revenue, the non-oil and gas revenue, Russia's total expenditure, and the net profit for the year to date. And we have all of that data. Now, in order to make the data a bit more user-friendly, I've transposed all of these figures into a spreadsheet and created some very exciting graphs. So let's dive into the detail and look at what's been going on with oil and gas revenues. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, and to tell you about their amazing 3-year deal, whereby you can get full coverage for just $1.70 per month, including an extra 6 months free and a no-risk 30-day money-back guarantee. If you use the internet without any form of protection, you leave yourself exposed to tracking, hacking, and advertising. Using Atlas VPN protects you from all of these. Atlas VPN provides you with comprehensive security and is used by more than 6 million people worldwide. So it's fantastic news that it will protect you from hacking and tracking and data breaches. But what's also great news is that it can save you money and open up a whole new world of entertainment, because it allows you to change your location, which gives you the opportunity to get better deals and to access content that may not be available in your region. Atlas VPN is available to use on unlimited devices for one subscription, and Atlas VPN are currently offering an amazing 3-year deal where you can get full coverage for only $1.70 per month, including an extra 6-month free and a 30-day no-risk money-back guarantee. So to purchase this exclusive Joe Blogs offer, please click in the description below. This chart shows the cumulative total of oil and gas revenue for Russia for 2021, 2022 and 2023. The figures for 2021 are shown by the grey line at the top of the chart, the figures for 2022 the orange line, and the figures for 2023 the blue line. And to make things easier to pick out, I've also labelled all of the actual figures onto the chart itself. The scale on the left-hand side of this chart is measured in billions of rubles, and along the bottom we've got the calendar months. So if we start off by looking at the results for October 2023, you can see that Russia has recorded total oil and gas revenue for the first 10 months of the year of 7.2 trillion rubles, which equates to around $80 billion. And the obvious thing to note from this chart is that that is below the figure for 2022 and significantly below the figure for 2021. And the reason that I've included 2021 on this chart is that it's the last full year that was completely unaffected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine started on the 24th of February 2022, so the figures for 2022 have been impacted by the sanctions that were introduced by the West against Russia from March onwards. And 2021 really gives us a true representation of what Russia should be achieving for its oil and gas sales if it hadn't decided to invade Ukraine. Now, in terms of a direct comparison against both years, the year-to-date figure for October 23 is 2.6 trillion rubles below the results for 2022, which is around 26%. And in terms of US dollars, that's a shortfall of around $29 billion compared to what Russia achieved this time last year. However, when compared to the 2021 figure, it's a shortfall of 13.2 trillion rubles, which equates to around $147 billion, and represents a year-to-date reduction in income of 65%. And I think that figure is really, really interesting because whenever I post a video on Russia and I'm talking about oil and gas revenue, I get so many comments from people saying that Russia isn't actually impacted by the sanctions, it's doing better than it was before it decided to invade Ukraine. But these figures, which have been provided by the Ministry of Finance of Russia, so they're not my figures, I'm not making up these numbers. This is the true data that Russia is publishing for all of the world to see, shows that their income from oil and gas in 2023 is 65% lower than it was in 2021, before there was any impact of the war. This chart shows Russia's non-oil and gas revenues for 2023, 2022 and 2021. The colour coding is exactly the same as the previous chart we've just looked at. However, I think what's remarkable about this chart is that the order of the three lines is completely reversed from what we've just seen for oil and gas revenue. The blue line here represents non-oil and gas revenue for 2023, the orange line 2022 and the grey line 2021. So if we have a look at the detail, the year-to-date figures for October 23 show that Russia has earned 15.9 trillion rubles in the first 10 months, which equates to around $177 billion. And interestingly, that figure is more than double the oil and gas revenue for the first 10 months of 2023. Now, if we compare the 2023 results against what happened in 2022, the current figures represent an increase in non-oil and gas revenue of 3.5 trillion rubles, which equates to around $39 billion. And that's a 29% increase year on year. But when you compare the 23 figures against the position from 2021, it really does raise a lot of questions, because the current figure represents an increase of 7.3 trillion rubles, which is around $81 billion and more than double the figure that Russia was posting before it decided to invade Ukraine. Now, in terms of explaining what this non-oil and gas revenue is, it's very difficult because I don't have a breakdown to be able to give you the details as to how Russia has managed to increase its non-oil and gas revenue so rapidly. However, one of the things that's driving the Russian economy right now is the war in Ukraine. And Russia has converted itself into a wartime environment where it's producing lots of military equipment to sustain the war effort. And whilst we don't have any specific data as to where this non-oil and gas revenue is coming from, it makes sense for it to be related to the production of items that are needed for the war, and therefore that could explain why there's been such a massive increase in non-oil and gas revenue over the last 2 years. This chart shows Russia's total revenue, which is basically the addition of the oil and gas revenue and the non-oil and gas revenue that we just looked at. And the first thing that's noticeable about this chart is that the lines are much closer together than they were on the previous two charts that we looked at. The grey line at the top here represents the 2021 results, the orange line the 2022 results, and the blue line the 2023 results. And before we dive into the detail, I think what's really interesting to note here just visually is that for the first 5 months, the 2021 and 2022 figures were almost identical. It's very difficult to actually differentiate between the two lines on the graph. However, from May onwards, there was a clear divergence between the two sets of figures. And if we now look at the blue line, you can see that in January and February, the figures were very close to the previous 2 years. However, from March onwards, there's been a clear divergence away from the 2021 figures. And interestingly, in September, the blue and the orange lines join. And in October, the blue line is now actually above the orange line. And if we now look at the actual results, the total revenue for the first 10 months of 2023 was 23.1 trillion rubles, which equates to around $257 billion. And that result is just short of 1 trillion rubles, or around $10 billion, above the results for 2022. That's around 4% increase. However, it represents a shortfall of 27.7 trillion rubles, or around $308 billion, against the 2021 figures. And that's a total drop of around 17%. However, that figure would be significantly higher if the non-oil and gas revenue hadn't been so strong. And there's still a major question as to where that increase of non-oil and gas revenue is actually driving from. Is it because Russia is simply pumping trillions of rubles into its war effort to keep everybody employed and to keep money circulating in the economy? Or is it for some other reason? This chart shows Russia's total expenditure over the last 3 years. And the thing to notice from this graph is that the blue line representing 2023 is at the top, the orange line representing 2022 is in the middle, and the grey line representing 2021 is at the bottom. So Russia has increased its expenditure in each of the last 2 years. And the main driver of that increase in expenditure has been the investment into the war in Ukraine. The results for the first 10 months of 2023 show that Russia's expenditure was 24.3 trillion rubles, which equates to around $270 billion. And that figure represents an increase of 2.6 trillion rubles, or 12%, against the figures for 2022, and an increase of 6.2 trillion rubles, or around $70 billion, or 34%, against the figures for 2021. And if you look at the shape of the orange line on this chart, you can see that there is an uptick in the last few months of the year. And if 2023 follows the same pattern, then it's likely that expenditure will continue increasing in the last 2 months. And the divergence against both the 2022 and the 2021 figures will therefore increase towards the end of this year. This chart shows Russia's net profit or deficit over the last 3 years. And I think this is probably the most interesting of all of the charts because it tells us whether Russia is actually making any money or losing money. And as you can see, the shape of this chart is very different to the other charts that we've looked at. The grey line, which represents 2021, shows that Russia was making profit in every single month, and that profit was consistently increasing throughout the year. However, the year-end figure did drop by around 1 trillion rubles as a result of the fact that Russia passes a lot of expenditure through its P&L in the final month of the year. If we now look at the figures for 2022, which is shown on the orange line, interestingly, Russia posted a net profit in every single month of 2022 up until November, when a net profit of 743 billion rubles was posted. However, in December 2022, there was a net downward swing of 4.2 trillion rubles, which meant that Russia posted a year-end deficit of 3.3 trillion rubles. If we now look at the figures for 2023, you can see that in every single month, Russia has posted a net deficit. So this represents a significant worsening of the position compared with 2022. And the year-to-date net deficit for the 10 months to October is 1.2 trillion rubles, which represents around $14 billion. However, it's extremely likely, given what's happened in the previous 2 years, that Russia will pass a large negative figure in the last month of the year. So the likely outcome for 2023 is that it will come in with a bigger deficit than 2022. And clearly, when you're comparing what's happened in 2023 and 2022, against 2021, there is a massive difference. Russia posted a huge profit in 2021 compared with a huge deficit in 2022, and it's likely that we will see another large deficit in 2023. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video to give you a detailed update as to what's happening in the Russian economy. I post a number of videos talking about specific items within the economy, but the figures that we've been through today give us a detailed breakdown of exactly what's happening with oil and gas, non-oil and gas, expenditure, and the bottom line. And as we've seen in today's video, oil and gas revenue continues to be significantly lower than it was before Russia decided to invade Ukraine. The results for the first 10 months of 2023 are around 65% lower than they were in 2021. And that really tells us the story as to what's been happening over the last 18 months. The sanctions that have been applied by the West against Russia have had a devastating impact on Russia's oil industry. Russia has been able to pivot and is now selling a lot more volume to India and China. So it has made up some of the gap. But there are a number of problems in terms of the way the Russian business is now operating. Firstly, it's had to cut its prices and sell its oil at a discount to the general market rate for Brent crude oil. And even though those discounts have been narrowing, we are still seeing a discount of around $10 to $15 per barrel for every single barrel of Russian oil. And that's obviously hurting the Russian economy in terms of lost revenue. But in addition to that, Russia have also cut back on their production. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that earlier this year, Russia first announced a cut of 500,000 barrels per day, which is a serious chunk of income. And they then followed that up with an additional 300,000 barrel per day cut. So in total, Russia have reduced their output by 800,000 barrels. And when we're talking about a price of around $70 per barrel for Russian oil, that is a serious amount of income that Russia has decided to forego. Now, in terms of answering the question as to why Russia have announced those voluntary cuts, I think that's a really interesting question, because OPEC Plus have announced their cuts to keep the price of oil up. They're deliberately restricting the supply so that prices don't fall in the light of the global slowdown. However, from Russia's perspective, there is a big question as to whether Russia have cut in order to keep prices up, or if they're having production problems and or difficulty finding enough markets to sell the volume of oil that they're producing into. So it may be that it suited Russia's purposes to actually announce a cut alongside the OPEC Plus cuts, and therefore give themselves more breathing space in terms of being able to deal with the volume of oil that they're actually producing. Because, as we've discussed many times before, Russia doesn't have anywhere to store that oil. So if it's producing more oil than it can sell, that's a big problem, and the only other option that Russia would have would be to turn the taps off, and it really doesn't want to do that because it's lost access to technology and also industry partners in oil and gas. And so if it does decide to cut back on its production because it can't sell the oil, then it could find itself in a world of pain when it wants to turn those taps back on. So it may well be that the production cuts that Russia have announced have been as a result of the fact that they're having production problems and therefore can't produce as much oil as they were prior to the war in Ukraine. Now, as we've seen from today's data, there has been a huge increase in non-oil and gas revenue. Prior to the war in Ukraine starting, Russia's economy was entirely dependent on oil and gas. However, the situation has now completely changed, and Russia is now earning a lot more income from non-oil and gas revenue than it is from oil and gas, and that does seem a bit puzzling. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I think one of the reasons for that is that Russia is currently converting itself into a wartime economy. So it's investing a lot of money into things that it needs to support the war. And if that is the situation, it's providing a short-term boost, a shot in the arm for the Russian economy. However, if the war in Ukraine does come to an end, obviously all of that would stop overnight, and there would be a massive gap for Russia to have to fill, because Russia's oil and gas revenues are significantly down compared to where they were in 2021. And the other thing that we've talked about today is expenditure, which is up by around 35% compared to where Russia was in 2021. And the vast majority of that expenditure is going into the war effort in Ukraine. So we've got a lot of different moving parts here, all of which are linked back to Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, which does seem like a crazy decision when you look at the bottom line. And the bottom line figure for the 10 months ended October 2023 is a net deficit of around $14 billion compared to a net profit of $106 billion for the period in 2021. So that represents a swing of $120 billion, which is obviously negative in itself. But I think the bigger issue here is that Russia have gone from making a profit, being in surplus, generating additional cash, to actually being in deficit and having to fund that deficit using its National Wealth Fund. And as we've discussed before, the National Wealth Fund has a limited amount of cash in it, and Russia is consistently drawing down on that fund to keep funding all of these deficits. And at some point, if this situation continues, Russia will run out of cash, and that will put them into a very difficult situation. And I think one of the biggest drivers in terms of how this war may come to an end will be the financial implications. If Russia gets close to the point where it does actually run out of cash and needs to have to sell some of its gold reserves to keep funding the war, that could be the wake-up call that the Kremlin needs to actually take stock and say, do we want to continue where we are, or should we try to negotiate some sort of settlement with Ukraine, the EU, the US, to try to end this situation? And my gut feel is that that's really the only way that this war will come to an end if Russia does run out of cash, can't keep financing it, and decides that actually it needs to call it a day. So hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face. I'm constantly being asked about the statues in the background of my video, and I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give one of these away as a prize. This guy here, who's an electroplated resin statue of a balloon dog, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I once posted a video about a balloon dog called Squeaky. Now this is a really fantastic piece, really reflective, quite heavy, and would make a great addition to any home. And you can win this for just £1, which is the equivalent of around $1.30, so really affordable. So rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle that I've set up to win this? Now, to keep things above board, I've got an independent company to take the cash for me and do the draw. So everything will be entirely independent. I won't be picking the winner. It will be all at random. But I will post this to anybody in the world that wins it. There is a possibility that you might need to pay a little bit of import tax, depending on where you live and what the import duties are. But this is your opportunity to win a genuine Joe Bloggs sculpture. So buy yourself a ticket and good luck in the draw.